Danny burst into any room the way sunlight crashes through stained glass, unapologetic, colorful, and impossible to ignore. In church, he was a fixture long before service began, sweeping down the aisles in bold blazers and silk scarves, greeting everyone with a hug, a compliment, or both. His laughter carried, full-bodied and joyful, and so did his faith. Danny sang in the choir like heaven depended on it, clapped on the offbeat with enthusiasm, and volunteered for everything. Usher board, youth dramatics, hospitality, altar decor. If there was a need, Danny had already signed up and added sparkle to it. But beneath the flamboyance was a man deeply anchored in belief. Danny prayed earnestly, spoke scripture with conviction, and had a gift for making people feel seen, especially those who hovered at the margins. He believed church should be alive, welcoming, and honest, and he lived that belief out loud. Some whispered about him. Others misunderstood him. Yet Danny remained unbothered, convinced that if David could dance before the Lord with abandon, then surely there was room in God's house for a little extra flair and a lot of love. A small but influential group of church members began to do more than whisper. They didn't question Danny's faith out loud, that would have sounded cruel. Instead, they questioned his presentation. His clothes were distracting. His gestures were too expressive. His voice, they said, pulled attention away from God. Behind closed doors, they framed their concern as a desire for order, reverence, and protecting the church's image. One by one, quiet meetings were held without Danny present. The choir director was encouraged to rotate leadership. The youth pastor was advised that Danny's involvement might confuse the kids. The hospitality ministry was reminded to maintain a certain tone. Each department received the same suggestion dressed in different language. It might be best if Danny stepped back. Danny noticed the shift before anyone said a word. Rehearsals he once led were reassigned. Planning meetings happened without him. Smiles remained polite, but the warmth was gone. Eventually, a church leader asked him to meet, not to accuse him, but to suggest that he serve in a less visible way, for the sake of unity. The confrontation cut deeply. Danny was forced to wrestle with questions he never wanted to ask. Was he a distraction or simply different? Was the church rejecting flamboyance or rejecting him? And could he continue to love a place that wanted his service but not his fullness? That question followed Danny long after the meeting ended. It echoed in the quiet of his apartment, in the stillness of early morning prayer, in the hollow space where joy used to rise so easily. For the first time in years, he sat in a church pew without lifting his hands. Not because he didn't believe, but because believing suddenly felt costly in a way he had never prepared for. Danny tried at first to make himself smaller. He chose muted colors on Sundays. He softened his gestures, swallowed his laughter, measured every word before it left his mouth. He told himself it was maturity, humility, sacrifice. But the truth was heavier. He was grieving the version of himself that had once worshipped freely. People praised the change. "You seem more settled," someone said. "You're growing," another added. Yet no one asked why his smile no longer reached his eyes. The ministries felt different without his spark, though few named it aloud. The choir sang on, but the harmonies lacked fire. Youth rehearsals felt mechanical. Hospitality became polite instead of warm. Danny watched from the margins, faithful but fading, present but unseen. One night, exhausted by silence, Danny prayed a prayer that scared him. "God," he whispered, "did you make a mistake with me?" The answer did not come immediately, but peace did not rebuke him either. Instead, clarity came slowly like dawn. Clarity came slowly like dawn, breaking through the gray fog of his compromises. Danny realized that while he had successfully protected the image of the church, he had inadvertently silenced the very testimony God had written into his DNA. He understood now that reverence is not synonymous with uniformity. By trying to fit into the narrow mold of order defined by the committee, he wasn't just hiding his personality. He was hiding a reflection of a creator who made both the steady oak and the dancing flame. The cost he had been paying wasn't just his joy, it was his integrity. He saw that the church's discomfort wasn't a reflection of his unworthiness, but rather a boundary of their own understanding. The following Sunday, Danny didn't reach for the muted gray sweater. He didn't rehearse a smaller version of himself in the mirror. He walked into the sanctuary not to perform or to rebel, but to simply be. The air in the sanctuary was heavy with the scent of old wood polish and the damp wool of overcoats, a predictable, stagnant stillness. Danny stood in the third row, his shoulders pulled inward, a habit of the last few months. Beside him, the congregation sang the opening hymn with a rhythmic, metronome-like precision, their voices blending into a polite, gray hum. Then the organist transitioned into a higher key. The swell of the pipe organ vibrated through the floorboards, thrumming against the soles of Danny's feet. It started as a spark in his solar plexus, a warmth that defied the drafty hall. 4 months, Danny had kept his hands clasped tightly in front of him, fingers white-knuckled and still. But as the soprano notes soared toward the vaulted ceiling, his muscles rebelled against the restraint. 4 months, he had kept his hands at his sides, but as the music swelled, his arms rose, not as a distraction but in worship. True unadulterated worship. From a boy, he had learned that those who come to worship God must worship Him in spirit and in truth, and His truth was a celebratory style of worship that he refused to confine to those who promoted a somber style of worship. It wasn't a calculated move, it was a release. His arm cut through the heavy air, palm upturned as if catching rain as he swayed and praised God with his mouth. The woman to his left, a member of the hospitality team who had once whispered about his distraction, stiffened. He felt her side eye, a sharp, cold prickle against his cheek. Behind him, the low murmur of disapproval rippled through the pews like a sudden wind. He could almost hear the invisible pens of the committee scratching marks against his name. Danny knew that his fullness might still be too loud for some. He knew that serving or worshiping in a less visible way was no longer an option, because God didn't call him to his light under a bushel. The atmosphere changed. It wasn't just that Danny was loud, it was that he was present. A young girl 2 rows over, who had been swinging her legs in boredom, stopped and stared. She watched the way Danny moved, unashamed, swaying slightly to a rhythm the others seemed to be fighting. She saw the light from the high windows catch the tears on his cheeks, turning them into streaks of silver. Across the aisle, a deacon cleared his throat, a sharp, warning sound, but the noise was swallowed by the sheer volume of Danny's yes. He realized then that he had spent months trying to be a statue in a museum of faith, when God had called him to be a living, breathing testimony. The somber style of the room felt like a funeral shroud, but Danny was dressed for a wedding. He didn't just sing the lyrics, he wore them. He leaned into the aisle, his body a conductor for a joy that the orderly meetings couldn't contain. As the final amen echoed and the organ faded into a hum, Danny remained standing, arms still raised, a vibrant streak of color against the beige wall of the status quo. He breathed in deep, the air no longer tasting like dust but like oxygen. The service ended with a heavy, ringing silence. As the congregation began to shuffle toward the exits, the atmosphere in the foyer was thick, not with the usual post-sermon chatter, but with a taut, electric tension. He didn't know if this path would lead him to a new community of believers or if it would force this one to finally grow. But as he walked out of the service that day, the smile finally reached his eyes. He wasn't just a church member anymore. He was a man who had stopped asking if God made a mistake and started believing that he was an intentional creation. The foyer was a grand, drafty space with marble floors that amplified every footfall into a sharp clack. Danny stood near the tall, arched oak doors, the sunlight streaming through the transom windows and catching the vibrant, mustard-yellow hue of his shirt, a defiant splash of color against the sea of charcoal peacoats and navy blazers. 3 men, the guardians of order, detached themselves from the shadows near the coat rack. They moved in a synchronized, slow-motion glide, their faces set in masks of practiced concern. Elder Harrison, the eldest, with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that flickered with the cold light of a judge. He smoothed his tie, a gesture of nervous authority. The others, they flanked him, arms crossed over their chests, creating a physical wall between Danny and the exit. "Danny," Harrison began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried above the sound of shuffling feet. "We noticed you found your energy again today." Danny didn't shrink. He felt the cool stone floor beneath his boots, grounding him. He looked Harrison directly in the eye, noticing the way the man's pupils tightened. Danny's pulse was steady, a rhythmic drumbeat of peace. "I found my truth, Elder," Danny replied. His voice was no longer the hushed whisper of the last few months. It was clear, resonant, and carried the warmth of a hearth fire. One of the younger deacons stepped forward, his leather shoes squeaking aggressively on the marble. He gestured vaguely toward the sanctuary. "It was distracting, Danny. People were looking at you, not the cross. The swaying, the shouting. It lacks the dignity this house demands." Danny looked at the deacon's hand, stiff, pointing, accusatory. Then he looked at his own hands, calloused and open. "You see a lack of dignity," Danny said softly, stepping into the deacon's space. "I see a heart that finally stopped suffocating. Tell me, Elder, When did the cross become so fragile that a man's joy could overshadow it? The silence that followed was brittle. A few congregants slowed their pace, hovering near the bulletin table, their ears tilted toward the confrontation. You could see the internal struggle on the faces of the leaders. They were used to Danny bowing his head, used to this smaller version of the man who apologized for his own shadow. Danny didn't wait for a rebuttal. He reached out and placed a hand on Elder Harrison's shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive move but a grounding one. He felt the man's suit jacket, expensive, stiff and suffocatingly structured. "I won't be serving in the less visible ways anymore," Danny said, a small genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Because God didn't make me in the dark, and I won't worship him there just to make you comfortable." He turned, his movements fluid and unburdened. As he pushed open the heavy oak doors, the bright, midday sun flooded the foyer, momentarily blinding the men behind him. Danny stepped out into the crisp air, his stride long and rhythmic. Behind him, the church was a silhouette of stone and tradition. Ahead of him, the world felt vast, chaotic and beautifully bright, and for the first time in a long time he matched the scenery perfectly. The void Danny left behind was not a quiet one. It was a jagged, uncomfortable silence that echoed through the halls of the church like a bell that had lost its clapper. In the weeks following his departure, the church foyer, once a place of lingering conversations, became a transit station. People moved quickly, their heads down, as if the very air had grown thin and cold. The choir loft. The most striking change was visual. Where Danny once stood, a kinetic burst of mustard yellows, deep burgundies and swaying limbs, there was now a literal gap. The choir director had filled the space with a tall, silver music stand, but it looked skeletal and hollow. Without Danny's rhythmic shoulder roll to set the pace, the singers stood like rows of stone statues, their eyes fixed anxiously on their sheet music rather than the heavens. The hospitality nook. The certain tone the committee had demanded resulted in a hospitality team that functioned with the sterile efficiency of a bank. The steam from the coffee urns rose in straight, unbothered lines. There were no booming laughs to break the surface of the quiet, no wide-armed hugs that crumpled suit jackets. The warmth hadn't just dipped, it had evaporated. Behind the heavy mahogany doors of the vestry, the atmosphere shifted from smug satisfaction to a prickly, defensive tension. Elder Harrison sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming a frantic, uneven beat on the wood. Before him lay a stack of inquiry cards from the congregation. The feedback wasn't about the theology or the budget, it was about the feeling. "The youth attendance is down 15%, the youth pastor muttered, staring at a smudge on the window. He didn't mention that the kids had stopped asking about order, and started asking why the most vibrant person they knew was suddenly gone. "It's a transition period," Harrison snapped, though his own voice lacked its usual flinty edge. He looked at the empty chair where Danny used to sit during planning sessions, the chair Danny had once draped a bright African print scarf over. The room felt smaller now, confined by the very boundaries they had worked so hard to build. On Sunday mornings, the influential group found themselves haunted by the ghost of Danny's expression. Every time the organ swelled, there was a collective, subconscious bracing, a wait for the shout or the raised hand that never came. The tension, you could see it in the way the deacons scanned the room looking for a distraction to manage, only to find a sea of polite, bored faces. They had achieved the reverence they wanted, but it felt like a funeral for a living God. The fractures. Whispers began to circulate near the coat racks. Not about Danny's clothes but about the coldness of the leadership. Families who had sat in the same pews for decades started looking toward the back doors before the final benediction was even over. The church had protected its image, but in the process, they had scrubbed away the thumbprints of the Creator's variety. They had a perfectly ordered garden, but they had pulled the only flower that knew how to turn toward the sun. The following Saturday the city park was a tapestry of weekend life, dogs lunging at frisbees, the smell of charred hot dogs drifting from charcoal grills, and the rhythmic thwack-thwack of a nearby basketball court. Danny found a spot near a cluster of ancient, gnarled oaks. He didn't bring a microphone or a stage. He simply sat on a weathered wooden bench, his vibrant electric blue scarf contrasting sharply against the earthy browns of the park. For a long time he just sat in the stillness, breathing in the scent of damp grass and freedom. Then, a melody began to hum behind his teeth. It was a hymn from a hymnal. He began to sing, "It is well with my soul," but not the version found in the dusty, thumbed-through hymnals of the sanctuary. This was a version born in the wilderness. His voice started low and gravelly, a baritone that seemed to pull from the very soil beneath his boots. As he sang "When Sorrows Like Sea Billows Roll," his body mimicked the waves. He dipped low, his hand grazing the tips of the clover, his frame swaying with the heavy rhythmic weight of a man who had nearly been pulled under by the order of others. As he reached the chorus, the restraints snapped. Danny's arms swept upward, his fingers splayed toward the blue expanse above. He didn't just sing the word well, he shouted it, a clarion call that cut through the sounds of the city. He spun on his heel, his scarf unfurling like a banner of victory, his laughter mingling with the melody. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of a cage. There was no distracting gesture here, every flick of his wrist and every stamp of his foot was a syllable of gratitude. He was a living exclamation point. Across the path, leaning against a rusted lamppost, stood Marcus, the teenage drummer from the youth ministry. He had been wandering the park, feeling the same gray heavy-heartedness that had settled over the church since Danny left. Marcus froze. He watched Danny's face, which was tilted back, eyes shut, drenched in sweat and glory. Marcus remembered the deacons telling him to keep the beat simple, and not to draw attention. But looking at Danny, he saw the lie in that instruction. Danny wasn't drawing attention to himself. He was acting like a lightning rod, catching the spirit and grounding it into the earth for everyone to feel. Marcus felt his own foot start to tap against the pavement. The mechanical feeling of his faith, the one that had felt like a chore for weeks, suddenly sparked. As Danny's voice broke the air, it wasn't a presentation. It was a roar of gratitude. It was raw, unpolished, and carried by the wind. He sang about the God of the storm and the God that made all things well. Unlike the sanctuary where his energy felt like a distraction, here it felt like an invitation. The people who gathered didn't look like the board of elders. A young man with charcoal-stained fingers stopped mid-stroke on his sketchbook. He watched Danny's hands, how they didn't just point to the sky but seemed to pull the light down. He began to draw the motion, the fluidity of a man who was no longer fighting himself. An elderly woman sitting on a folding chair leaned forward, her eyes bright. She didn't see disorder, she saw the kind of worship she remembered from her youth, before life had polished the edges off her own joy. She began to clap, a soft, syncopated beat that matched Danny's steps. A man with headphones around his neck paused, mesmerized by the sheer honesty of the display. There was no stained glass here, no heavy mahogany doors to hide behind. Just a man, a park bench, and an invisible, undeniable fire. And then he noticed Marcus, his past drummer, tapping along to his song. Danny realized at that moment that he had spent years trying to light a candle in a room where the windows were boarded up. Out here, under the vast, unblinking eye of the sun, his light didn't compete with the darkness, it danced with the day. Danny ended the hymn not with a polite fade, but with a triumphant, soaring high note that seemed to hang in the air long after his breath gave out. He stood panting, his chest heaving under the bright blue fabric, his arms still wide as if he were embracing the entire horizon. He wasn't waiting for a committee's approval. He was listening to the echo of his own soul. Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the lamppost, his eyes wide, his hands slowly coming together in a solitary rhythmic clap. "Danny," he whispered, the sound carrying in the sudden quiet. Danny turned, his face glowing with a fierce, unadulterated peace. He didn't look like a man who had lost his church. He looked like a man who had finally found his temple. Marcus approached slowly, his sneakers crunching on the gravel path. He looked at Danny, really looked at him, noting the sweat-soaked collar of his vibrant shirt and the way his chest still rose and fell with the exertion of his praise. "They said it was too much, Danny," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. "In the meetings they said you were making it a show. But seeing you just now, I don't think I've ever seen anything more real." Danny wiped his brow with the back of his hand and sat back down on the bench, patting the wood for Marcus to join him. The boy sat, hunched over, his hands tucked into the pockets of a dark hoodie that seemed designed to make him disappear. "Marcus," Danny said, his voice warm and grounded, "there is a difference between a performance and an overflow. A performance is for the eyes of people. An overflow is for the heart of God." They couldn't tell the difference because they've spent so long measuring their faith with a ruler instead of a pulse. Danny reached out and tapped the rhythm Marcus had been tapping on his knee. "You're a drummer. You know that if you play with no heart, you're just hitting plastic and metal. But when you lean into it, the whole room vibrates. That vibration, that's truth. When I was in that sanctuary trying to be orderly, I was a drum with a hole in it. I was making noise, but I wasn't making music." Danny held up his hands, palms open. "They want you to worship in a way that doesn't disturb the dust on the pews. But God is a consuming fire, Marcus. Fire moves. Fire dances. Fire changes the shape of everything it touches. Marcus looked toward the playground, where children were screaming and running in chaotic, beautiful circles. But how do I do that there? At the church? Every time I hit the crash symbol too hard, Elder Harrison gives me that look. Like I'm breaking something holy. Danny leaned in, his eyes locking onto the boys with a fierce, protective kindness. You aren't breaking anything holy, Marcus. You're breaking something stiff. If the house is too small for your joy, you don't shrink your joy. You find a bigger house. Danny stood up again, his posture tall, his shadow stretching long and bold across the grass. Don't ever apologize for the way God chose to light you up. If they tell you to be quiet, sing louder in your spirit. If they tell you to sit still, let your life be a dance they can't ignore. Marcus stood too, and for the first time he pulled his hands out of his pockets. He rolled his shoulders back, mimicking Danny's open stance. The gray weight that had followed him from the sanctuary seemed to lift, replaced by a spark of the same fire that lived in Danny. I think I'm done trying to be settled, Marcus whispered. Danny grinned, a flash of white teeth and pure, unbridled triumph. Good. Because the world has enough settled people. What it needs is people who are alive. As Marcus walked away, he didn't slouch. He walked with a bounce in his step, his hand drumming a new, complex rhythm against his thigh, a rhythm that didn't care about order, only about the beat of a heart that had finally been given permission to soar. The transition didn't happen in a boardroom or through a formal invitation. It also didn't take in fast. It happened because the light Danny had carried into the park acted as a beacon for the weary. For several weeks, Danny and Marcus visited different congregations, their presence a quiet experiment in belonging. They sought a place that didn't just tolerate their fire, but needed it to stay warm. They sought a community that would be consistently welcoming and inclusive. They finally found it on the edge of the city, in a building that had once been an old warehouse. It was a space defined by exposed brick, high steel rafters, and windows that let in the raw, unfiltered movement of the street outside. There were no velvet pews, just mismatched chairs and a floor that looked ready for the weight of dancing feet. When they stepped through the doors, the air didn't smell like stagnant wood polish. It smelled like rain and cedar. The walls weren't decorated with the stern portraits of past leaders, but with vibrant murals of a diverse, suffering and celebrating humanity. Like the 2 weeks prior, a woman with silver hair and a denim jacket approached them. She didn't look at Danny's bright, patterned shirt with suspicion. She looked at his eyes. "Welcome again," she said, her voice a low, musical rasp. "We've been praying for more color in the room." In the corner, a group of musicians was tuning up. There was a cello, a djem drum, and an electric guitar. The music wasn't a rigid march, it was a conversation. The service began and the presentation was non-existent. The leader stood at a simple wooden podium and said, "Bring your whole selves today. The broken parts, the loud parts, the parts you were told to hide. God isn't looking for a performance, He's looking for a person." Danny felt a familiar prickle at the back of his neck, but this time, it wasn't the cold sting of judgment, it was the heat of recognition. When the music started, a soulful driving rhythm that echoed off the steel beams, Danny didn't hesitate. He didn't check the rows behind him. He stepped into the aisle. His arms flew up, his body swaying with a fluidity that felt like water breaking through a dam. Beside him, Marcus sat behind a drum kit that had been sitting empty. He caught Danny's eye, and with a nod of permission from the worship leader, he let out a thunderous rhythmic roll on the snare. It wasn't orderly. It was a heartbeat. People around them began to respond. A man in the front row started to clap with a heavy, joyous beat. A young woman began to twirl in the back. The room wasn't a museum, it was a workshop. As the sun began to set, casting long amber rays through the warehouse windows, Danny realized he was no longer a distraction to be managed. He was a vital part of a living mosaic. He looked at Marcus, who was playing with a grin that threatened to split his face in two. He looked at the diverse crowd, people of all ages and backgrounds, some weeping, some laughing, all moving. Danny closed his eyes and sang. His voice, once a source of concern for the influential few, was now a thread in a tapestry of triumph. He had found a house that was large enough for his God, because it was finally large enough for his fullness. The circle was complete. He hadn't just found a new church, he had found a home where the only order was the commandment to love one another. 3 months had passed since the sanctuary of Danny's old church had become ordered and quiet. Elder Harrison walked down the cracked sidewalk of the industrial district, his black umbrella tucked tightly under his arm like a baton. He was there to scout a location for a new charity initiative, his polished loafers clicking rhythmically against the concrete. The neighborhood was a maze of rusted corrugated metal and brick, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of his own parish. Then a sound hit him. It wasn't the distant hum of traffic or the screech of a subway. It was a vibration, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to rattle the very windows of the warehouses. As he rounded the corner of 4th and Main, he saw it, the old textile factory, its wide glass panes glowing with an amber, flickering light. Harrison stopped. The windows of the warehouse were massive, industrial-sized portals, and because the sun was beginning to dip, the interior was staged like a theater. Through the glass he didn't see a formal service. He saw a riot of life. There was Danny. He was wearing a shirt the color of a burnt orange sunset, his arms thrown wide, his head tilted back in a laugh that Harrison could feel through the brickwork. He wasn't standing at a podium. He was moving through a crowd, his hands landing on shoulders, his presence acting as a physical spark. Harrison's breath caught. Near the front, silhouetted against a mural of a rising sun, stood the Henderson family. They had been pillars who left 3 weeks after Danny. Mrs. Henderson, a woman Harrison remembered as a stiff, silent presence in the 4th row, was dancing. Her eyes were closed, her hands raised, her face transformed from a mask of duty into a portrait of peace. In the back, on a raised wooden platform, was Marcus. The boy was no longer slouching. He was a blur of motion behind a drum kit, his sticks hitting the brass cymbals with a shimmering, explosive energy. He looked powerful. He looked like he finally belonged to himself. Harrison stood in the shadows of the alleyway, the wind whipping his coat around his ankles. He looked down at his own hands, pale, clasped, and still. Inside the warehouse, the disorder he had feared looked remarkably like a family. He saw people he had labeled distractions, now acting as the foundation. He saw a homeless man he had once seen turned away from their soup kitchen sitting at a table with a young lawyer, both of them swaying to the same soul-stirring melody. There was no reverence in the way Harrison defined it, no hushed whispers or bended knees in fear. Instead there was an electric, undeniable holiness. Danny caught sight of someone near the window. For a split second their eyes met through the glass. Danny didn't scowl and he didn't look away in shame. He simply smiled, a wide, radiant expression that held no malice, only an invitation that Harrison wasn't ready to accept. Behind him was a mural on the warehouse's wall which said everything the old church had forgotten. Worship is the sound of a soul coming home. Then in smaller letters, I will praise you for I am fearfully and wonderfully made, marvelous are your works and that my soul knows very well. Psalm 139 verse 14. Harrison adjusted his tie, the silk feeling suddenly like a noose. He turned his back on the amber light and the thrumming music, stepping back into the gray, quiet shadows of the street. He walked away quickly, his loafers clicking on the pavement, but no matter how fast he moved, he couldn't outrun the sound of the joy he had tried to vote out of existence. Behind him, the warehouse roared with a triumph that didn't need a building to be a church. The warehouse, now known simply as the Forge, became a landmark of color in a city that had grown used to the gray. It wasn't just a church, it was a sanctuary for those who had been told they were too much. As the seasons changed, the impact of Danny and Marcus's courage began to spill out of the warehouse and into the surrounding streets. The once stark walls of the neighborhood were transformed. Danny worked with local artists to paint massive, sprawling murals that depicted stories of hope and diversity. One wall featured a man with arms wide, his scarf swirling into a flock of birds, a silent, towering tribute to the freedom found in the park. On Friday nights, the heavy warehouse doors were rolled open. Marcus led drum circles that invited neighbors to find their own rhythm. The sound didn't draw complaints, it drew the lonely. People who would never have set foot in a traditional cathedral found themselves drawn to the raw, honest vibration of the drums. The community didn't just sing, they served. They opened a wardrobe of joy, filled with colorful clothes for those going on job interviews, believing that everyone deserved to feel seen and celebrated. Even the old church felt the shift. While some members remained rooted in their order, others began to drift toward the warehouse. They came to see what it looked like to live without the fear of being distracting. They found that when you stop trying to protect an image, you finally have the energy to protect people. Danny stood on the loading dock of the warehouse one evening, watching the city lights begin to twinkle. He wasn't the man who had been whispered about in quiet meetings. He was a man who had built a table where everyone had a seat, and every seat was a front-row view of grace. He took a deep breath of the night air, adjusted his vibrant scarf and stepped back inside, where the music was just beginning to rise, loud, unashamed, and beautiful. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Matthew 5 verse 16. Thank you for listening. Tell me in the chat where you're listening from and let me know if this story connected with you in some way. Be bold and start the conversation.